Starting. So here we go. This is 18C. We just need to get through this. Now, I'm not going to sit here and name every blood vessel in the world. It shouldn't take that terribly long. And it starts here. So 18C is really a physiological chapter that we revisit. And it really has a lot to do about like blood pressure and things like that, regulation of blood flow. So it's certainly important. So I'm not making light of it. I just wanted to show you. This is really all about the physiology. As I just already showing you the scrolling that's going on there. And it deals with the physiology of blood coming out and in. There's a nice picture of pitting edema, which is another interesting commentary. A lot of something we see when the heart fails. And so we'll get to that. And this is back to the circulation. The pulmonary circulation, very short shift. Nothing really to discuss so much about it. The systemic circulation, much more about what we're going over. So, I mean, so there's effectively, there's not a lot for the pulmonary. The pulmonary trunk is really what emanates, divides into right and left, goes to the lung on either side, respectively. Oxygenation occurs, returns by the pulmonary veins. And, you know, we saw this already before. Then we go out by way of the aorta. That's what you're seeing, my bad artwork up front. So, and effectively, that's what we're looking at, the pulmonary circulation. You will see that by and large, the arterial supply to the lungs comes from something called the bronchial arteries. The pulmonary arteries, other than maybe the interior lining and the pulmonary veins, there may be some degree of blood supply to those areas that are within in the hollow tubes themselves. But to the muscular and other connective tissue structure that make up those arterial and venous tubes, it comes from something called the bronchial arteries, which come off, what I will show you in a second, the descending part of the aorta, that despite my artwork up there goes behind the heart. So arteries run deep. Again, as I showed you before, at the end of class, veins are both deep and superficial. Okay, deep veins are really go along with the named artery. And there's typically two. We call them vena comitantes, at least two, sometimes more. So where you take your radial pulse, got a couple of veins, femoral pulse, popliteal pulse, posterior tibial pulse, doesn't matter. So they share the same name as the artery. Superficial veins do not correspond to the names. And again, superficial veins are like, I told you a little bit about that anecdote vis-a-vis bypass grafting. They sort of classify what I like to call body spare parts, stuff that are useful but non-essential. So we can graft. They're graftable materials because we can get by. Venous pathways are much more interconnected. Veins have more than one name, making venous pathways harder to follow. The brain and digestive system is very unusual. I'll spend additional time with that and the brain is more complex than I really need to go into. The digestive, the hepatic portal system, that's the one I was alluding to before. All the blood that comes out, venous blood that comes from the stomach, the small and the large intestine, that's where everything that you've ingested, the vast majority of it comes in, and it has to be processed. It has to be detoxified. So we get to the physiology of digestion. That's where that liver is so tremendously important. I can't emphasize that enough going forward. When we do physiology, the liver is part of it. And I hate these pipe diagrams, so we're not going to use them. You know, they just go, here it goes from artery to venous and artery to venous and blah, blah, blah. I don't care. Okay, red and blue. I don't like the pipes. They're just hard to memorize. Okay, yeah, a lot of things vis-a-vis memorization. Ooh. There's not a lot of memorization. There we saw for the written test. I'm going to try to get it to you tomorrow by Friday latest, probably email it to you. For the next practical, we'll do a take-home test. You don't have to thank me, just keep good vibes for those Steelers. Even if you're not, and why would you be anything but a Steeler fan? So one victory means a lot. There's a gauntlet. out to the Chargers next week in LA. At least he can make that a home game. They don't care. My son was stationed in San Diego, and at the old Qualcomm Stadium in San Diego, he lived very close to that when they were stationed there. He goes, they went to the game. He goes, it was almost all Steeler fans. That's when the Chargers did. It's like it was their home game at Heinz Field. So axillary, brachial, femoral, etc., body area, the organ, and you'll see so on and so on. Location, what bones it goes by. They also run with nerves. In general, it goes vein, and that's what I meant about the dissection. You have the vein, most superficial, then the artery, and the nerve deeper. Okay? They don't always match. There's some oddballs, and I hate that. I mean, if I looked at that, I would tear up the slide. Too busy. And I'm not in love with these either. Because when you have that much information, but that's what we're following. So the best way to start is probably here. And even though I don't love that diagram, effectively what we're going to do, this is the start of the aorta. And carrying onto the aortic arch. What comes off the aortic arch is basically head and neck. So that's what I'm going to go up and talk about on the board very shortly. It's this. Now, obviously, we're looking from the right side, okay? And so we're going to be looking at some of these vessels that are there. Imagine this is the arch. We're not seeing, they aren't showing the left side, but there should be stuff coming off of it here. So we're looking at the right. So if you can remember that perspective, and hopefully you do, well, I'll come up here and up the and show you. So effectively, coming out of the heart is the start of the aortic arch. Heart selfish, first vessels right after the semilunar valves, the coronary artery. Again, coronary artery are one of those oddballs where you don't have coronary veins. Veins are called cardiac. There's only really two of those. And the other one's going up in your head where you have carotid arteries where somebody's taking a pulse, CPR, and when it comes back, right there, juggle. I didn't name them. I've said it. Can we change this? It didn't right. Being facetious. So this obviously is the aortic arch. The arch is over. It goes behind the heart. My bad, heart work. When it goes behind the heart, pull up the thoracic aorta or descending. See your S first out. Then descending. Aorta. And we get here, once it goes through the diaphragm, we're at certainly the big abdominal area. What's happening up top? There are three vessels that are, it's important, three vessels that are given off by the aorta. The first one is going to service the right side of the body, the others, because everything other than that is bilateral and symmetrical. The whole idea is that effectively, because the heart has grown and it's much more massive, as you saw on the left than on the right, effectively it's gone from midline urinary development down to the left side. So they develop a connector that takes the blood basically behind the sternum. It's referred to here as, which means brachiocephalic. So arm and head. Brachiocephalic trunk. And anytime it says trunk, you know it's going to be branching off. So that brachiocephalic trunk is off. That's the parlance we use. This would be the right common carotid. And again, if it's common, it's going to break apart. This is the subclavian, which goes right under and below your clavicle. I'll just put an A next to it. The subclavian. And then over here, coming off the subclavian, very important, cerebral artery. You remember, and most of you got the question right. That little hole in the cervical vertebrae is called the transverse foramen. They make a protected circulation. Look. I don't know where it went. All right. Then we had a skeleton and here. I'm not going to carry the darn thing over. I'll drop it. But effectively, what you're seeing there in those cervical vertebrae are the vertebral arteries. It's a backup circulation. So going to your brain, the main blood flow to the interior of your brain, here we're going to see comes from the vertebral, from common carotid. And when it says common, it means it's going to bifurcate into, and be split into the internal carotid and external. And this is where we get back into cranial and facial. We talked about the skull. The internal carotid services your brain. Eventually, it's going to join up with a continuation of these vertebral, and again, it's right here, right. And this would be the right internal and the right external. Now, on the left, we don't have to worry about that. We have a left common carotid, a left subclavian, and a left here. So I always feel the need, even with my terrible artwork, to show you. If I go over here and I'll show you with the cursor, I promise I'm going to try to make it the last time I draw it. Hopefully, you're busy. Haven't you been in one of those places where one of the instructors sees you texting, they have an absolute secret? Okay? Put away your phone. That's disrespectful. I could care less. They're paying me to teach you. And you can watch a TV show if you want. If I could do Everton is playing Sunderland in the Premier League, I would watch that as well. I could put it on my phone. You're all not funny. Not funny at all. So, looking here. So, the continuation, as you will see, here is the brachiocephalic. Here, when it begins, so the brachiocephalic, rather, is down here. Here's the common carotid, right behind the angle of your jaw. A little below it is where the bifurcation occurs. And you have external carotid servicing the face. The termination of the external carotid is here. There's an artery, and sometimes you'll see people, it'll be inflamed, they'll have terrible high blood pressure. It's called the superficial temporal artery. And that boom, like that. And you'll see it almost, you can literally see it pulsating. It services the facial area. There's a branch of it. Remember that foramen spinosum? Okay? That foramen spinosum doesn't have a nerve that goes through it. It has a blood vessel. It's a branch of the maxillary artery, okay, and it becomes the middle meningeal artery. It actually comes up through the foramen spinosum and services the external aspect of the meningeal layers on either side. So when someone gets hit bang on the side of the head, one of the things you really worry about is rupturing the middle meningeal artery. You can get a giant bleed from that. It's comparatively big. Even though it looks like a tiny opening, in blood vessel terms, that's pretty big. But well protected because it goes through a fairly good sized bony enclosure. It's not on the surface. So that's facial. Remember, external carotid, we think facial. Internal carotid is going inside. It's going to service the brain itself, particularly the cerebral lobes, most importantly. And it's backup supply. So you have two carotids anterior and two vertebrals posterior. So if someone has a blockage in one, you've got to count them, 3 other vessels that hopefully have some degree of, the fancy word is patency. Patency. Patent means open. It's spelled like patent, like you got a patent for invention. in this context, we say patent to distinguish it from the patent office. And so here you can see the vertebral arteries in that protective series of transverse foramina. And now you can begin to see, once they are given off, there's some other vessels that go costocervical, thyrocervical, no big deal. You get the continuation of the subclavian, and then as it reaches the axilla, it's just a continuation. It becomes the axillary artery. It's almost as though it's anatomically, I don't know the exact landmark, probably has, it's almost as it passes, let's say, that posterior shelf-like aspect, like the area in and around the subscapular fossa. And that's the circulation from that side. So obviously it's on both. The naming is different. Before we get to right carotid and right this and right that, the brachiocephalic trunk effectually is carrying it over. Interestingly, on the way back, the veins, there are two brachiocephalic veins, one on either side, and when they jump together, bringing blood back from the upper extremities and from the head neck area, they meet to form the superior vena cava. It's their confluence that occurs. This is the culmination. This is called the vertebral basilar system. Here's that sort of the undersurface of the brain that we looked at when we did the brain dissection. Coming up along the brain stem here in the medulla area, this is where you see the vertebral arteries. They join, and that sort of like central cleft, they meet to form something called the basilar artery. Collectively, they're called the vertebral basilar system. I remember when I was a student, and I'm working with, for whatever reason, an x-ray, and we're doing an arteriogram. They had a neurosurgery resident. Basically, we call it a squirt. He's squirting dye into this. Imagine you could dislodge a clot, so you have to be on top of that. Into this person, had to start a line in his neck, inject the dye. You got to make sure nothing terrible happens. And he's doing this squirt, as they called it. And I'm asking him all sorts of questions. And he invited me, maybe I told you, to be part of a neurosurgery, which I had to refuse since I don't think my insurance there would have covered it. But it's unfortunate. So, but it comes up here, and this is called the circle of Willis. So the posterior portion of this circle, and notice the traffic in this area. Here are the mammillary bodies, this is the infundibulum. Pituitary gland sits in the sella turcica here. You have the circle of Willis, and around and in that same area, you have the optic chiasm. That is one of the most important areas in the human body. That's why when someone, for years, if someone had a glandular pituitary tumor or pituitary cancer, though most of them were benign, if you went in there, they almost surely were going to lose their sight. And this is an area where a lot of aneurysms form. They're called berry aneurysms. It's like a tiny bubble in a tire. They can burst. We see a lot of them. Statistically, a lot of young Black men have high blood pressure. And unfortunately, when there's a lot of times there'll be something tragic will occur, and all of a sudden they'll be very healthy and they'll just literally just drop dead. And then when they do the post-mortem, they've had a berry aneurysm that's ruptured. And I mean, if you have an idea of they're there, now the technology with MRIs and MRIs with contrast, you can identify these things, and maybe some type of surgical procedure would work. So it's a really important area. It's called the circle of Willis. Willis is a proper name. And so effectively, it's a circle. And the beauty of the circle is it's being fed from the internal carotids, from the basilar system. And so if there's a blockage here, we can get around this way. There's a blockage here, or there's a blockage here. That's what I mean. So they erroneously call these things some places roundabouts. You ever see those on the road? Where I come from in New Jersey, they're circles, traffic circles. Let's go into the traffic circle. I guess they didn't want to build lights. Going to Philadelphia from South Jersey, some of those traffic circles, you had to be very brave to get through. or just a little bit crazy. I think I was more in the latter than the former. Okay, they're all there. They basically service the cerebral lobes. Close up. This is the upper extremity. It's the continued, the part, okay, coming off this, you can see thoracic arteries, some of those pulmonary arteries I was alluding to, brachial arteries rather, would service in this particular area. It's not, I don't get into that. I want you to look at the major circulation in the interest of, being relatively brief. Here's what it looks like. Better way to view it. Subclavian gets its name because it goes under the clavicle. As soon as it passes the clavicle and the border, this lateral border of the scapula, effectively it becomes the axillary artery. It's just like, Pennsylvania to Ohio to whatever on the turnpike. As soon as it exits that axillary area and comes adjacent to the humerus, it is now called the brachial artery. The brachial artery, and this is a pet peeve. It dries because when you're taking somebody's blood pressure, normally when you're using a cuff here, which is a better way to read it than using one of those stupid wrist cuffs, which are very inaccurate, is when you do it up here in the upper arm area, the sensor has to go midline or slightly to the medial aspect. People have put this behind. They don't know what they're doing. Drives me crazy. I've torn one off and oh my God, you're a terrible patient. No, you don't know what you're doing. It's like people who draw blood. Do your brains roll? Do you know how to draw blood? Give me somebody who knows how. I drew blood forever. Started IVs for 2 years. Didn't have the problem. Hey, pet peeve. So you have one brachial artery that's central and slightly medial. What goes around, remember in the heart, we had arteries and the coronaries that went around the area, they circumflexed or went along the margin. This one is called the deep artery. And so effectively, it generates a lot of posterior circulation. The main brachial artery splits into, as you might guess, the radial artery and the very famous, easy to get radial pulse, and the ulnar artery. Okay, we're done. The only thing that I worth noting is here. When it gets into the extremities, all right, I have to write something again, forgive me. Whether it's a hand or a foot, we just draw a generic extremity. What happens is that you have the arteries come in and they form what they call an arch. And you have the arteries, so if this is dorsal, and let's say this is palmar, you have an arch that's on the top, and you have an arch that's on the bottom. There's no way I can do it. And you have tiny perforators. And what happens is, let's say somebody has a bad accident, and they fall on a cut here. Those arteries, you can't do anything with it, you have time off. Okay, so they disrupted your circulation here. You would think, oh my God, the top here, the top of your hand, the back of your hand, why don't you go some no? Because of the perforators, the blood can come through the palmar area, the same for the foot, and supply it. So it's a safeguard. And they have these little perforators that typically are found in between the metacarpals and the foot, and then they have these perforators. These always have surgery there. It's very interesting the way in the foot, it's the same. The veins are a little easier because there's so much networking. So that's when you look at these arches or arcades. There's different ways that I've seen them expressed. But here you have a deep palmar arch and a superficial palmar arch. And eventually what comes off of them are the digital arteries. A lot of times when we're talking about the thumb, as we move on, you're going to see the term hallux. Pollux is for the thumb. Hallux is for the big toe. They got their own name. So, I don't go crazy about that, but you might see that when you start to study it or some of the resources or listen to something about this. So to summarize, subclavian, axillary, brachial, bifurcates roughly at the elbow, radial and ulnar, and you can see this sort of generous circulation, both palmarly and dorsally, that from which the digital arteries emanate, going to all of the thumb and the four other digits. Gotta love that. So that's the way it works. The most complicated, so same on both sides. At this point, we're all bilateral and symmetrical. The only oddball is right frickin' here, the abdominal aorta. So there are three structures that penetrate the diaphragm. You have three openings in the diaphragm, yet they have, where they penetrate it, it's sealed. The diaphragm effectively seals around them, so it's airtight. The three structures are the esophagus, which we'll get to when we visit digestive. The aorta going from thoracic or descending to abdominal. Once it pierces the diaphragm, it's abdominal. And the inferior vena cava. Because even when it pierces it, it's still on its way to the heart. It's still the inferior vena cava. Those are the three areas. When we get to the one about the esophagus, we call that the esophageal hiatus. That's when we go back and hear about a hiatal hernia. And you probably know somebody in your family or your acquaintances who has, oh, we can't eat that because he or she has a hiatal hernia. We'll go back to my dad with that one. Very cool. A lot of great dad and mom stories, as you probably heard. So moving on, the distinctiveness about this, is it bilateral symmetrical here? Sure. Is it bilateral symmetrical going to the adrenal gland? Sure. Renal arteries, you bet. Gonadal arteries, you bet. Lumbar area, perfect. Does it split into two down here in the common iliacs? Absolutely. The big problem is your gut. Okay, think of it this way. The abdominal aorta is a single structure. Your alimentary canal is a tube that sits in front of it anatomically. You have the aorta this way and one alimentary canal. I know the stomach's here and the liver's here and blah, 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 blah. Intestines are all over the place. Effectively, it's one hollow tube that happens to be twisted, folded, etc. So you have one set. All these arteries go out side to side, except the three arteries that supply stomach, spleen, and liver, called the celiac trunk. The ones that supply most of the small intestine, the superior mesenteric, and the ones that supply most of the large intestine, the inferior mesenteric. And they can't draw it in front because you couldn't control it. So it's as though you took this and went forward like this. Okay? That's why it's a unique circulation, and we consider them somewhat separately. After this, it smooths out. We're out of here. Oh. I have to thank each part of the service. Still thank you. Okay, I can take the hit. I just had two wonderful nursing students I hadn't seen in almost 2 years who are doing great. Come to see me and thank me. You guys, it's okay, Christmas is coming. You could be like my one class, I was pushing. I said, gee, I'd like a set of those really nice, like those, what were they? The Beats cordless headphones and all that stuff. Five Below, they got me kitty headphones. Like the $5, like Batman, Snoopy. I get that kind of attention. No prisons. All right, here you are. So now you in blue, you can see the inferior vena cava. This is the celiac trunk. It gives off three vessels. Effectively, without going crazy over them. Okay, the celiac, when you see trunk, hepatic artery supplying the liver, the splenic artery, this is the spleen, it's part of the, basically we're going to see the lymphatic immune system. We're going to cover that anatomy. And lastly, the gastric artery and the stomach. When you see gastric, it refers to the stomach. Down below here, and you're going to see where this cut away, is the superior mesenteric. That basically supplies most of the small intestine, and farther down, as you will see, is the inferior mesenteric. Again, that's mostly colonic areas. The large intestine, or the name for the large intestine, is the colon. But that's important, those three vessels. Here it is cut away. These are a lot to remember. Okay, you're going to see this diagram. I'm going to send it back with you. You're going to label it there. So the next practical ends with this. Is why I wanted to do it today. I hope to get it out to you Wednesday latest, maybe, and just send it to you. And you can just hand it back to me. Don't have to thank me. It's part of it. And you're not going to thank me because you don't like me. So here's that. There's the hiatus for the vena cava cut away so we can see it. Here's the diaphragm. It's here. First arteries that give it off after it penetrates the surface of the diaphragm. They're called the inferior phrenics. Here's the celiac trunk. Below the celiac trunk and above the superior mesenteric is, or are rather, the right and left supra, for above, renal arteries, also known as the adrenal arteries. Adrenal means adjacent to the renal area, which means next to the kidney. It's adjacent, next door neighbor. Then between the superior mesenteric, and you can see the inferior mesenteric is quite a ways down from that, but immediately after that, notice the girth. Skinny, skinny, wide, skinny, skinny gonadal arteries going down there. And the other lumbar arteries are kind of narrow. Look how wide the renal artery is. So in between the adrenal arteries, or suprarenal arteries, as they're more officially known, in the middle of that, between the renal and the suprarenals, is, and the superior mesenteric is larger than the inferior in diameter, the wide renal arteries. The kidneys are a high pressure filter. That's why they are anatomically wider. They are designed to bring the blood much more rapidly to, than say the arteries going to the gonads or the arteries going to the adrenal glands, much, much, much more rapidly. The biggest problem, the kidney, I said it before, if the kidney doesn't get its way, if there's an infection, if there's damage, if there's not enough blood flow, it shuts down. There has to be, if that pressure drops, we have a name for that, shock. And that makes your kidneys shut down. And that is not a good thing. So, and here you can, so they are the wide renal arteries. That's why they're easier to identify in like a diagram. You will see the unlabeled one. Below that, of consequence, before you get to the inferior mesenteric, are the gonadal arteries. Understand that, like when we get to certain structures, like in repro, gonadal arteries mean ovaries and testes. They supply other areas. The very famous spiral arteries actually come off of, which you're going to see are called the internal iliacs, which we're going to get to. They're the ones that are involved in menstruation. So we'll see that when we get to the anatomy at the very end. We do male and female repro at the end. Fairly straightforward. The anatomy in the male repro is a little bit more, and you can see, look what's here. You have the kidneys, you have the ureters. So these are all, and the name we give these are called retroperitoneal. They're kind of all on the back wall. They're not moving around at all. Whereas a lot of the anatomy of the alimentary canal is free to move around. There's a little artery that services the sacrum area, not a big deal. And there, the termination of the abdominal aorta are the very, very famous common iliacs. And you will see that they branch into the internal and external iliacs. The internal iliacs service, ilium, name for the bone, service most of the pelvic area. The external iliacs, as you will see, go under what's called the inguinal ligament and go and form the femoral artery as they cross under that ligament in a little tunnel. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is where the blood supply to the lower extremity comes from. That area. We're getting there. So here's a look. This is mostly the branches of, here's the branches of the inferior mesenteric. Here are some branches of the superior, but you get a look at it. This is, again, this arcading or arching. A lot of times they sort of curve and arch and give off vessels that go into and supply, in this case, the colonic tissue, or maybe in a smaller area. So you have superior mesenteric, intestinal arteries, blah, 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 blah. Not holding you to that, just general. And now, there's the abdominal aorta. There's its termination, or bifurcation, rather, into the common iliac. And again, you're going to have an external iliac is going to come down this way, and then you have the internal iliac. That's more about, again, now we're talking about additionally anogenital structures, again, that going to in a female, going to the uterus, etc. So here it is up close and personal. So you can begin to see these. Here's the iliac. This is the inguinal ligament. It goes from the symphysis pubis to what's called the anterior superior spine of the ilium. What goes underneath, there's little passageways for the femoral artery to go down, the femoral vein to go up. That is an anatomical weak point. Nerves traverse that area as well. When you hear about a sports hernia, that's where it occurs. A sports hernia or rupture, which can occur in both men and women, but more frequent in men, means that part of the bowel has basically penetrated that area for whatever reason, typically lifting and straining, more so than anything else. Some people are more susceptible than others. My middle son has had bilateral hernia surgeries done 15 plus years ago, and he still has to be pretty careful with the lifting and stuff like that. And he does relatively physical work. He's going to be 42 at his next birthday. So as it passes underneath, we have the femoral artery. The femoral artery gives way to the deep femoral artery, where here you have and so nowadays you'll talk about lateral circumflex and medial circumflex. Years ago, we used to just call it the deep femoral artery. That's fine. You'll get arterial supply to the gluteal area. Here, the obturator artery, that'll supply some of the groin muscles or the adductor muscles. And then as you see it coming down, you can see a variety of these structures. And so when they say it circumflexes, it sort of comes around to the side, comes back forward, anastomoses. What's interesting here is the femoral artery services the thigh at the large muscle here on the medial aspect of the femur, and there's a tubercle there called the adductor tubercle. There's a tunnel or passageway. So that femoral artery is going along anterior medially, and when it gets to here, just above your knee, there's a tunnel or passageway. It goes posterior. So it goes, interestingly, from in front, along the medial aspect, to behind, and splits apart into the area behind your knee called the popliteal fossa. It's wild, but it's exactly what it does. And so here, you'll see the continuation. Here it is. It has gone behind, as we look at fibulus here. So there's that passageway. It's called the adductor canal. Okay, it passes through the popliteal artery, and you see it gives off, we call it a trifurcation, 3 vessels. Okay, it gives off the anterior tibial artery, which goes along the anterior portion of this, the interosseous ligament, services the top of the foot. It goes through, it splits again to give up the posterior tibial that goes behind the medial malleolus, and it becomes the medial and ends as the medial and lateral plantar arteries. They too have arch plantarly and dorsally, same deal as the hand does. And the fibular artery that goes around here services the calf area and the lateral aspect of the foot. That's it for arteries. Briefly with veins. Very briefly, because this is too busy. Ugh. Short course. So we have 3:40 now. With any good luck, I can get it done in 5 minutes. Look at the optimism. stop texting yet, or you just want to know? When I first started teaching, I would care about stuff like that. Not anymore. Sorry, you guys pay more attention to me than my kids do. It's okay. So veins, we're going back. So you have the deep veins are named for the deep arteries. Radial artery, radial vein, ulnar artery, brachial vein, whatever. They're all the same. Subclavian vein. It's not hard. I don't have to rename them. The key is what Ava asked me about with the superficial veins vis-a-vis varicosities in the upper extremity, and these are ones that they did use eventually for my dad. Now they're used more commonplace. Then it was relatively weird. And it's not just the anatomical position. If you do this, superficial, the big superficial veins are collecting all the blood. There's one on either side. Their names are cephalic toward the head, basilic toward the floor. Cephalic and basilic. All you have to do is do this, you never forget. Cephalic vein, all these veins here all come together. One is the cephalic, a lot of IVs, you can see it right here. Okay. You start an IV there, particularly when it's stay there for a long time. Or here along the basilic side. And so this would be one of those veins that you sacrifice. Again, it's not essential. A lot, and what happens if you, I was very sick, two veins, there's a little crossover here, it's called the median cubital vein. That's usually what it is. I was in the hospital for 2000, maybe 3 weeks, less 3 days. I was very, very they had taken so much blood, my arms were literally blind. I mean, totally, because veins are veins, they're going to give out. Eventually, they're going to lose their ability. They have to put central lines in, take blood. So, I mean, you sit there and look, I wonder if I'm going to be permanently black and blue, but I wasn't. See. So without going to the diagram, so again, like this, cephalic, basilic, median cubital vein is there. In the lower extremity, the ones that are typically used for grafting because they're larger, this is called the greater saphenous vein. It starts just anterior to the medial malleolus, sort of on the top of the foot, all the way up to the femoral vein, very close to where it goes back. It goes under the inguinal ligament to form the iliac, the external iliac. That's the long or greater saphenous or saphenous. The short saphenous or saphenous is along the fibular aspect, anterior to the lateral malleolus, and it kind of dives in and joins the popliteal vein. And that's all significant anatomy. You see the names. I don't know how they do it in this because it's so small you can't read it. Here, great saphenous vein, again, the long one there. And they'll say, yeah, short, small, lesser, short. Doesn't matter. All the same darn thing. In the head, these are the sinuses. So it's coming, you have in that, okay, the longitudinal fissure, you have a sinus where the dura separates, superior sagittal, the one between the cerebrum and the cerebellum, the transverse sinus. You collect blood in from the straight side. You don't have to know any of these. And it's going to come in, and effectively that's going to form the internal jugular. And so you have other sinuses more anteriorly, the facial area, and they all come together, coming back in with the internal jugular. The external jugular will join it, and it will form these two brachiocephalic veins on either side. We don't have that flip-flop, and you end up in the superior vena cava. So it's a good look to see him here. So you have basically the external jugular and the internal jugular coming together, forming what we would endeavor to call that then just probably the jugular vein. And here then it's forming that brachiocephalic vein, vertebral veins. Here are those sinuses. Here are the sinuses again, superior sagittal. The straight sinus is in here, in that area between the cerebrum and the cerebellum. And you can see this cavernous sinus is sort of there underneath the thalamus, third ventricle area, etc. And as you might guess, jugular foramen. And as you might guess, going upward, the arteries, carotid canal. Again, the jugular foramen, you have a lot of those cranial nerves going through there as well. Nothing really special here. Cephalic, okay? Your cephalic's on the thumb side, the lateral side. Here's the median cubital for blood draws. You can see it here even better. This is very intricate. The blood collected from the inferior and superior mesenterics, all of those four, okay, all of that blood and whatever vessels are coming out of the stomach, okay, they're all forming blood and taking it to the liver. It's called the hepatic portal vein. You're going to see that again. More detail when we do digestive. It basically percolates the best way. It kind of flows through and bubbles through the liver, gets detoxified, gets processed, the materials that are in there, and it's returned by the hepatic vein into the vena cava. The key to that is the digestive stuff. There's a bunch of stuff in there that has to be processed or cleansed. That's the liver's big job. The liver is so super essential. It's there. You see it cut away. Now you just have renal veins. Here's the hepatic veins, fine, flowing in. They kind of have the other thing cut away. Here's the portal vein entering the liver. We'll go into this and the anatomy of the things that flow in and out of the liver. The liver is quite large. And then, again, underneath that inguinal ligament, now we have the here's greater saphenous. You see it over here a little bit easier. You're done. And you thought this was going to be arduous. 3 o'clock and 47 minutes.